right. Hello, everyone. I'm very, very happy today to have first-time guest on my channel, Brandon from Brandon Books, with whom I can say that I feel like I've become friends in the last month or couple of months. And I believe we share a lot of interaction with other booktubers. And but in particular, if you're listening to this video and you haven't seen Brandon's channel, please do, because we are very much on the same line when it comes to reading tastes and book tags, tastes, and also I think our pleasure with getting into the details and getting into the deep analysis of whatever we encounter in our bookish readings and bookish adventures. So thanks very much, Brandon, for being on the line. Where we don't, when we are not particularly in line, maybe, is in our existential worldview, and that's what has maybe sparked a couple of interesting dialogues online, on YouTube between us, and then on probably Instagram and other places, where it got so interesting that at a certain point we said, okay, let's just stop and have a chat, because this could be really interesting to share, not only the two of us talking about this, but with other people, whoever has an interest in hearing about, somebody like me who comes from an Italian Catholic background, moves into not caring anymore for a period of time, atheism, I would say, maybe, and then back to Catholicism, to your path, which I understand is very different, and maybe it's the right time to ask you to maybe give a quick intro and your thoughts about this topic.
Yeah, well, first of all, yes, thank you for inviting me on. And you are officially the first person who I've been on their channel. So I'm excited to be a guest and not a host. You can take some of the labor pains. But yeah, it's not only the fact that we agree on so much and then disagree on this one pivotal point that I think is so interesting, or why I want to talk to you. It's also how you've been able to speak to me about it so far. And again, it's only been through comments, but you're a little more open-minded. You're a little kinder. You're, and you do understand the other side, because I've had comments like similar to yours that are wanting to argue, wanting to debate, and that isn't a very warm welcome. I would probably enjoy doing that at some point, but with you, I know it's going to be more of a conversation of understanding each other, and also maybe hopefully challenging to both of us on what each of us thinks and how we arrived at certain conclusions. But we have ended up, through careful consideration and what I would consider logic for both of us, on two extremes. And I think that's fascinating. So for me, my background is very fundamental, traditional Christian background. My parents were missionaries in South America, Central America. I was born in Guatemala on the mission field, raised up. Yeah, it's they were down there during the 80s, during the Civil War. So, wow. Pretty crazy. They were medical missionaries and did a lot, just going through these different villages and tribes and helping out and witnessing, using that as a platform. But they moved back to the States and things didn't work out between them. They got divorced. And so my dad went one way and my mom stayed very much in the faith. And that's how I grew up. I went to a Christian school, all Christian friends. And yeah, the long story of it is that it took a long time before I even started to have the idea that maybe I wasn't right about what had just been presented to me as truth from the beginning. And I kind of made my own version. I think this is something a lot of fundamental Christians do, is move into more of a moderate or liberal state of Christianity. And I found that to be so watered down that I couldn't reconcile anymore. Well, the Bible really does say this, and it might come off fundamentalist, but if I believe that this is inerrant, then this is actually probably what it is. And it got to the point where I was either going to be way over here, committing my life completely, raising a family on the mission field similar, or it was, this isn't real. And it was in that last push of trying to really divine certainty and truth that I ended up over here. So that's where I am at.
That's by the way, a very wonderful and compressed way to summarize something that is so complex for you in a short way. And as we were chatting just before this this quick video, I really think the best way to approach this type of topics, even in order to make it, let's say, in any way useful to anyone who is participating or listening, is to make it as personal as you can, because very often, so it's about your own personal path, but not only the culture, the background and all that, but also what each term of the matter, be it faith, belief, God, etc., really means to you, also emotionally, linked to your personal history, because you said it well. There is a big portion of logical thinking and rational thinking that goes into our views, our worldviews, and that's a big part of it. But human beings are not powered by reason; they're powered by emotion, and so there's always this.
Unfortunately,
right. As we both admire this author, Jonathan Haidt. We both like Jonathan Haidt, right? And I don't remember which book he was mentioning this rider on the elephant. That is a rider.
Happiness hypothesis. Yes.
Exactly, happiness hypothesis. But really, it's the elephant that is the one moving, and so we have this elephant, which is we can call it very simplistically, that our emotions, that and then we as the rider are kind of an advocate, a devil's advocate, or a lawyer or an attorney, who is always able to find the logical reasons for those choices, and that's kind of the way our brains tend to work, no?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's why it's interesting and fundamental to look at each person's history and background and what's attached emotionally to each term of the question, because we know the arguments. We read a lot of books on one side and the other. So if I think about those years where the religious question or the religious life was not part of my life anymore, I know that there was always in the back of my mind a kind of voice, calling and talking to me, that either I brushed away, or sometimes, I have to admit, I would follow it and show up at church randomly by myself, because there was a church. And I was also exploring, because in London you have a lot of choice. You have a lot of choice of different religions, from Presbyterian to all the different flavors, let's say Anglican, of course, Catholic as well. And so I had a chance to experience and see some of those various, you could call me, I was a bit of a restless soul who was searching. And that was in my, I would say, maybe early 20s. I don't think it's very easy to articulate exactly and accurately what leads you to your worldview changes, because they're so deep, and it's almost like if they asked you, why do you choose to be with your wife, or why did you know something about that, but you don't know everything, right?
Yeah, that's a good example.
Something that is so deep that you necessarily are missing. The way I tell myself the story of the whole change back, and let's call it reconversion, is that through the presence of my wife, we were not even married yet, we met in London, I felt like there was a whole change, I think, that was very deep in me, but still my mind was rebelling. I felt with the love that I could see in my wife, love for each other, I could see that it was almost in a Dantean way. You know, Dante and Beatrice, Dante has always seen Beatrice as God's way to call him, you know, God's way to reach out to him. A way to kind of try to be pulled or feel like I was being pulled back towards religion, but my mind was rebelling. My mind didn't like it and still kept pushing back. And my wife wasn't really asking me or being insistent or forceful about it. She just happened to be Catholic, but in a very, you know, regular, normal way. So intellectually, it was actually a book by Joseph Ratzinger, our Pope Emeritus and former Pope who spectacularly resigned a few years ago, about science and faith, which is a very dear topic to me, that did something to my brain. Kind of, you know, when all the things
allowed you to bridge that gap a little bit.
Yes, yes, like a very, you know, fine-tuned key that finally locks in the right way. It just worked for me. See, I'm trying to explain something that, as I said, it's really difficult to explain, but that's the best way that I can explain it.
Yeah, when you actually come out and try to say it, and I had so many questions pop up during it, but I wanted to let you finish. I'm curious though, if there seems to me to be a difference when you're young, especially like a formative teenage year, which is kind of when I'm picturing you first starting to go through that, of not caring about your religion, having it not really be a heartfelt thing yet. Maybe it was just, you know, more tradition. There seems to be a difference between falling away from that and atheism. And you mentioned at first, when you kind of introduced it, that not only did you fall away, but you went almost, you know, full on atheist. And we could get into all the, you know, different definitions of agnostic and atheist. But to me, there still seems to be a big difference between non-religious and atheist. And it seems like a very drastic shift to go from childhood religion to atheism back to some kind of reconversion. So do you think you ever got to a point where you did not believe there was a reason to believe there's a God?
I think it's an excellent point. I think an excellent point. And I think you're right when you say that in my personal history, probably I did not get, you know, to that point where I would define myself as fully atheist. It probably would have been more correct or accurate to call me non-religious or falling out, whatever the best way to call it is. Even though in those years, I remember in my thinking, not being able to accept, not being able to not only accept, but also to grasp the concept itself of God, the concept of the divine, and as something more than nonsense, as something more than almost a Richard Dawkins level, you know. So I wasn't really right there, but close. And now with my hindsight, I look back and I think I know that in that moment, if I could travel back in time to see myself, you know, back then, I would be able to explain things from a rational standpoint to myself back then that would start to make more sense, if that makes sense as a concept, because I hadn't encountered particular concepts, and so I was ignorant. I was ignorant about Catholic theology back then. So I don't mean that if I was back then, I see future Tom meeting myself and he explains to me, and so things change all of a sudden. I think, you know, it would have been just a what are you talking about type of conversation, but at least from that logical standpoint and those steps that Joseph Ratzinger helped me do in my brain, it would have helped. I hope it makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think that if we're comparing paths, it's obvious to me if you don't have, and I don't know to what degree, but if I'm guessing here from what you've said, you know, you're just growing up in it, and it's almost if no one takes it super seriously other than, your priest or some other authority figure that you're already naturally bent on rebelling against, and you haven't been given any theological material to make it more substantial, that it becomes benign or you become apathetic. Like I totally get that. I think the reason I didn't have my deconversion until much later in my life is because from a very early age, I had so much ammo, such an arsenal to throw at why religion is true, that I was able to convince myself much longer than the average person. One, just being born in a missionary family, like my mother was not reading me bedtime books. She was reading me stories of martyrs. When I went to church on Sunday, we were there all day Sunday. We were there Saturday night for prayer. We were there for Wednesday. We had Thursday small groups. Like, I was involved in something. It's funny. It's here in the States. I know you're in LA now, but just comparing our childhoods, it's called Junior Bible Quiz. And I don't know if they still do it, but it was very serious for kids in the 90s. And I was like #1 in the nation. I was one of the first kids ever to get this Wordmaster. I went to nationals. It was team-based, but I was still #1. I mean, the amount of memorization I had and theological expertise at a young age, I think did what it was supposed to. To me, I consider it indoctrination, but it did what it was supposed to. It kept me in the faith. It gave me ammo when I came up against the public school kids after transitioning out of private school to say why that didn't matter, why that didn't make sense, and to remain so committed. And so it took me much longer to get to the point, I never got apathetic. I never got rebellious. My rebellion was to the peers around me who weren't believing, not to the institutions or authority figures. And it got to the point where, and this sounds so bad to say it out loud, but I remember having this thought earlier in my young adult life that was, I feel like I'm the smartest person I know that still believes in God, because anyone else in my life that had any kind of an intellectual background or cared about academia in any way or read significantly or anything that we could group together into this more knowledge, more thinking category had no longer found a way to hold to their childhood belief or convictions. So,
interesting.
It took me a long time.
I mean, you know what? I think whoever is listening to this chat, especially if there are people who read a lot, might at least find a resonance in the fact that we are both, you and I, intellectually demanding people. We've been reading a lot during our life. You cannot sell us something easily without giving us a fully cogent, pretty strong case for it, at least from a theoretical standpoint. And so that's what your story makes me think of, the fact that you got to a point, most likely in many circles or environments where you found yourself having religious discussions, you probably were the one who had the most deep level of information, and maybe because of your upbringing or your own intellectual curiosity, and you were surrounded by people who did not have the same level of intellectual curiosity that you do. Maybe not all the time, but it sounds like that's the case, right?
So it would be frustrating to have some of my best friends that grew up in the same church, in the same Christian school, who never considered, never even knew there's another worldview. And I mean, for years of their life, young married individuals, out there going to church, part of the community, having influence in people's lives that I never saw, struggle, doubt, consider. It makes me always cautious of their conviction. And then two, but the opposite was true. Anyone who ever did think, look, read, consider another viewpoint seemed to kind of fall off. And so it's just this tricky middle ground of, and to my understanding, and you can talk about the manipulation of these verses, the Bible has a lot to say about not seeking certain kinds of knowledge and what the definition of faith is. It's with not demanding evidence, etc. And to me, it always seemed like it had to be that to keep you, because as soon as you look past that, you would realize, and I know you're not going to be able to agree with that, but
Well,
yeah, it got to the point where I felt like you almost had to be ignorant to try to remain in the faith. You know what I mean? That sounds harsh. I don't mean it like that, but.
Yeah, no, but I completely understand it though. And to the extent that you tell the way you are feeling, you know, I completely understand it, because I was there as well, at least in part. In my mind, in my brain, it didn't just click. It was much easier from an intellectual point of view to see it as something for people who are not intellectually curious. That's the difference.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, there is a stereotype that the religious person, if you believe in God, especially today in the secular world, only an idiot could believe in God, but not idiot in the sense of stupid, in the sense of lack of intellectual curiosity. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and that's why you're an anomaly to me, and it's one of the reasons I was excited to speak with you, because I have had conversations in some form of this regard where I have said as much that I would struggle to believe that if the world was blank, and you're not blank because you did have a Catholic upbringing. So I think there's a caveat, but the world was blank and you just threw down a bunch of holy books, you know, all of the different belief systems that have ever existed, and you let someone with an intellectual mind read each. Would anyone just pick Catholicism, Christianity, and say, this is true, and none of these others are, and I can know that? And I know that's taking the personal relationship out of religion, which is obviously part of it if you believe, and also kind of destroying faith. So it's not a super fair example.
No, but it's rational. It's rational.
It's a little bit to just put a fine point on, I think, because it always comes down to that. When you're debating with someone or arguing with someone, you know, at some point the clash happens where they say, well, you just have to have faith. And I think that must be the case, because I just can't imagine someone from zero with no personal relationship to speak of or no indoctrination to uproot in to say, here, this book makes sense. This lines up. This is the truth. This is the light. And so for you to go back because of a intellectual curiosity and scientific worldview is fascinating to me.
Yeah, well, you know what? I found myself the intellectual depth, intellectual curiosity of many people within the Catholic world new and fascinating when I found it, which was later in my life. I love that example when you describe, you know, we are in this white space and all the holy books are raining down and we randomly pick them up and then try to, like you say, this is, it would be impossible to read any of those and say, oh, this makes perfect sense. I'm going to embrace this one instead of that one. Because a lot of it, going back to the point that human beings are powered by emotion, but, you know, we're not powered by reason. There is all that childhood, not rational indoctrination, but childhood cultural absorption that justifies the fact that you belong in one place instead of another. You have been absorbing smells, words, language, culture, traditions, and so your being kind of belongs to something, whether you like it or not. And then you can rebel against it. That's fine. You're free to do that. But then you get to a point where you have a view on all the different options that are out there, and you rationally rebel against the notion that only one of them can be true. And that's very difficult, very, very difficult to accept. There is a joke, but it's not really a joke because it's very deep, by G.K. Chesterton. He said, he was talking about open-mindedness as a value of modernity, which I still believe is a value, but it kind of has potentially, in some respects, gone overboard and beyond where it's positive. And he said, always try to be open-minded, but try not to be as open-minded as to let your brain fall out of your head, of your skull. It's a joke, but I love it because it kind of means, yes, keep your eyes open all the time. But my suggestion to you, this is Chesterton suggesting to us, is hold on to something, stand for something, because that's what is best for the human being to do. The alternative, and I'm not talking about somebody in particular, and especially I'm not talking about you, but in general in our society, the alternative is to become purely an observer, somebody who is so detached from reality and doesn't participate in any of all these options that are given by reality, because he sees them all, he studies them all, he reads books about them all, but he is not part of it. And that's a very almost inhuman place to be, very lonely place to be. We are wired to join, to participate, to enjoy something in life and to stand for something. This is also what Dante says, if you don't stand for something, Dante puts you in the first circle of hell, which is the neutrals. They keep flying around, just after the door of hell. He didn't have time for people who didn't take a stand or a position.
Oh yeah, it's common amongst almost all religions, the lukewarm. I mean, even in Christian text, it's the only place Jesus spits you from his mouth is not being hot or cold, right? So I think that theme is very prevalent amongst any kind of ideology. You get in or get out, and I think it can be. I feel myself rebelling a little bit against what you've said, and I know you're not presenting all as your ideas, but I think that where that gets scary for me is it sounds a little bit like if I can't identify perfect truth, then my best bet, so as to not be lonely or to give into my communal nature, is to find what fits best and move forward. And I may be not representing everything you said perfectly, but I think that I'm representing what many people do, which is why I think most people are lukewarm. Most people are not fanatics in their religion, or do not even believe every aspect. And if they do not act out of that belief accordingly. Most people, to use the word maybe devout to say that group. So the people that are less devout, however you want to suggest it, I think is because they still want to belong. They want to go to church on Sunday. They want to believe. It's hard not to believe. They want to know that when they die and their child dies, they're going to be together. It's easier than existential dread. And it can lead to the opposite of truth. It's what's the word? It's compromise, which I don't believe. If there is an absolute truth, compromise is lukewarm to me. That's the aspect of not being in. So I think so many people that put themselves in to belong to commune are actually the ones not engaging. Do you know what I mean? It's like this healthy, safe space.
I think so. I think I understand. But to be devout and to be a fundamentalist, or maybe to be really on fire about your own faith, I don't think you need to go to specific extremes that we have in our imagination for each religion. I consider myself to be pretty much on fire about my religion as the depository of truth. Again, we can talk forever about the word truth, okay? But that's where it is. And if you talk about this problem of the variety of multiple religious offering in the world to scholars and theologians, I'm saying within the Christian, within the Catholic, let's say, world, they will say there is a spark of light of truth in many religions that is reached in one way or the other. Some parts of Islam reach levels of truth that are very similar to Christianity. Some others do not. When we talk about this problem of rationality and everything else about us, right? The rider and the elephant. The real crucial problem is in between, at the meeting of both those things. And that's not a coincidence that Christ finds himself precisely at that connection, at that meeting point between human and divine. So am I open to believe that everything that is said in the gospel about Christ is true, and that he lived, he resurrected, etc.? Yes, I am. And this makes me a devout Catholic, makes me not somebody who compromises, because I trust that it's all true. And obviously that's the big difference, no?
Yes, of course. And really, I think what it boils down to trust that it's true is faith, right? Would you say that's an accurate definition of faith?
No, absolutely.
And I'm fine with that. And this is where it got me. I'm fine with me not knowing. A lot of people, I think, reject religion because they feel they can't know. Well, I can't know for sure. I've never touched him. I'm fine with maybe there is a higher power. Maybe there's a creator, and maybe his ways are higher than mine if we're using scripture, and I just won't know. And I'm even fine with him needing me not to know for it to be real. And we can get into the problems of free will and faith. But aside from that, I can get so many places. And then where I can't make the final leap is the reason you have faith, or anyone who believes have faith, is because of the book. Like at some regard, yes, there's a personal relationship, or your wife showed you the love and beauty of a powerful God. And I'm not dismissing that. But the only reason you have that concept, the only reason you can put a name to who that God is, or that there is an afterlife or anything, is from the book.
And the doctrine. And the book, the doctrine and the church, which maybe is a little bit more, there is this difference that I'm not qualified to talk about between Catholicism and every Protestant denomination, where maybe the book has a little bit more weight compared to doctrinal and church teachings. But yeah, I understand exactly what you're talking about.
So, and to your point, I almost feel like it would make it easier in Catholicism, because you have a living doctrine still happening. You still have a voice of God that's adding information. And that's why when the Pope versus a Pope 3 times ago has a different stance on, say, gay marriage, Catholicism can move forward with the times, where many religions are set on their one fundamental clause that can seem outdated, immoral, etc. And I think I don't mean this blasphemous at all or to ridicule. I think it's kind of a neat trick of Catholicism to be able to adapt with,
to a certain point, though, because to a certain point, because you need to be very careful about the words. Gay marriage is not something that the church has embraced, despite how the media like to color.
No, you're right. Maybe that was a poor example. I should say that there's been caveats made and changes in the attitude and behavior towards things that used to be burned at the stake by the same Catholic Church that is now, yes, maybe not endorsed, but accepted, understood,
absolutely
dealt with, right?
Yes.
And so in that way, there is this way of keeping the church, specifically the Catholic Church, in tune with the time while still being adherent to the doctrine or the original text, that I wouldn't have in fundamental Christianity. So that's why a lot of me, and this is something that atheism, I think, gets a really bad look at. Like if you look at the new atheist, a lot of people who criticize the new atheist are saying, you're only attacking fundamental Christianity, which is the easiest thing to attack. Like, we get it. Noah's Ark didn't happen. The world is not 6,000 years old. And yes, you will always look like the hero when you debate those people because there's too many facts. And what's frustrating to me, though, because I totally understand all of that, is that this moderate or liberal or moving goalpost, if going back to the Catholicism, is to me just what we've done to evolve a religion. And if we were actually honest with why we believe, it starts at that book. That's even what the doctrine builds on, or I'll just talk about Christianity to stay in a vacuum. It comes down to the canon of our 66 books, which has also changed, which is problematic, that if I find error in there, then I have no reason to also believe that that same book that tells me I should have faith, that faith means anything. So for me, I kept coming back to all the issues I had with the Bible or with any other holy book that were so obvious to me to be human and erred and flawed in a natural human way and not divine. And that anything that I tried to gain that was divine, faith, personal relationship, revelation, I only had those concepts or those terms or those ideas because of the book. And I only had the book I had because of where I was born. And I really just could not get past this, that I would be a fundamental Muslim if I was born in a different country with my same mind and my same ability to latch on and to believe and all the predispositions I had in my DNA. That to me, that doesn't seem like there's free will or actual truth out there if it can be that different. You know what I mean?
I think so. Yeah, I think I understand, and you actually articulated it really well. I keep trying to be careful about the Catholic versus Protestant war, because there are those slight differences, at least, where Catholic fathers of the church, so-called, so, you know, doctrinal writers from the 2nd, 3rd century, etc., they tended to insist on a reading of the Bible that is still valid today, which is, they call it programmatic or propaedeutic, and which is valid still today, where most, if not all, of those issues that the Old Testament creates with we know what all of them are, right? The violent God, or etc., need to be read under the light of the New Testament and under the light of Christ. That there was St. Augustine who then, I think, formalized and articulated this doctrine for the Catholic Church. So if I take Jesus Christ and his life as the highest level of hermeneutics and interpretation of the entire Bible, then things actually do make sense, and it's easier for me to discern the truth. You know, there are some things that are monolithic and will never change, but at the margins, it's an alive organism. And as an alive organism, as the bride of Christ, as the church is called, will keep living and have some marginal corrections and caveats here and there. I don't think the main pillars have really changed or will ever change, because that's what it's built upon.
So, and I think that you and I both share a non-goal of just debating. So I'm trying to be careful and keep that in mind. But I do think it's okay to question each other back and forth to try to sharpen the points, because I'm curious how you've arrived at a couple of the things you've arrived at. And the only way I can think to explain why I'm curious about it is to tell you how I did not arrive there, which sounds like debate. So I'm torn, but
no, it's perfect for me.
Here's part of the issue I have. I think what you're talking about, and tell me if it's different. What word did you say? A programmatic reading?
I think propaedeutic is probably the right word.
Propaedeutic. Is that like the moral reading of scripture versus literal? Is that the same thing, or is there a different element to what you're talking about?
No, the interpretation of the scripture as a growing education, basically, a growing education. And I think, you know, that an education that grows and culminates in the life of Jesus Christ. So something that prepares, but really doesn't give you the full revelation until, and doesn't give you the full truth until you get to Jesus Christ in the scripture.
Okay. So that I would say that's probably a hair even further than like a moral reading, which is someone just saying like our morals change, our values change depending on the context and culture we're in. Like a warring culture is not going to have the same context of reading that as a peaceful culture. And at times tribes had to be at war. Like this is a part of life. And so reading that then is different than reading it now. But you're saying that it's more, you mentioned the word hermeneutics earlier, this understanding of priority in message and obviously the culmination being salvation through Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
So
I'm simply parroting, Joseph Ratzinger and these theologians. It's not my opinion, of course.
No, sure. No, I just I wanted to divine if there was a difference between the moralistic reading and the word I cannot pronounce that you have said, because that particular word is new to me. Though I do love St. Augustine. And in terms of when I was first like trying to find some apologist side of explaining some of the doubts and curiosities I had, I mean, in 300, he had foot the bill that still like people like Frank Turek today are not even as capable of handling. And yeah, I think he's a fascinating, brilliant thinker. I just don't agree with the end result. The problem I have that I can't seem to get past for that. So as an example, we'll just take slavery. And as you mentioned, yes, there's clear things in the Old Testament that seem problematic. And you're saying in light of Christ and the full message, not problematic or not reason enough to take away truth. And to me, it seems myopic in a sense of time. That just because New Testament, just because 2,000 years later, which seems like a long time to humans, God is seemingly acting different, turning the other cheek versus eye for an eye, is like a lot of people who look at Old Testament versus New Testament, I think their biggest thing is the time past, and it's more recent and modern, Jesus is, than the God of the Old Testament. And I don't think that's quite what you're saying. I want to be fair to your argument. I think what you're saying is that Jesus is the reason. So even though it happened later and it's more modern to us, that's not why it makes sense. It makes sense because he finally fulfilled what needed to be fulfilled to get away from those things.
Correct. Yeah, it's we can consider the fact that Jesus came in the historic time when he came as a complete mystery that nobody can answer. But aside from that,
the best answer I've heard for that, by the way, the best answer, it's funny, I forget which apologetist did it, but the best answer for that was that it was a very specific time when you had two things. You had Roman roads and you had the world learning Greek because of Alexander. And so you had a way to travel the message and a common tongue to do so, which I thought was always a good argument about why God waited so long. But I just wanted to bring it up. But back to my issue. My issue is that if there is truly an all-loving God that treats us as children, and there had to be a time frame where things could not look loving while he set up the game to end in the finale that it did. I just, like, if I am a parent, I can't imagine like setting up a situation where for the first, it depends what you believe. If we're going off of just like biblical history for 2/3 of life, the first 4,000 years versus the most recent 2,000, 2/3 is still a lot. And if it is evolutionary speaking, we're talking 99% of all time, humans have been in miserable suffering. And it seems that until 2,000 years ago, that's what was expected of us, that we had no say in it. It didn't matter where we were born. It didn't matter what we believed. This is the penalty for life, original sin, which I have a lot of problems with original sin as well. And so bringing Jesus as a savior to that is like treating my kid terrible for the first 4 years of his life, and on his 5th birthday saying, here's a best friend that now I'm going to beat instead of you. And I know that it sounds a little childish to just paint this picture, but I don't see how it's that different. He had the ability to have Jesus from the beginning. He did, the 3-in-1 on the day of creation. And it didn't get out of his control. He's omniscient. He's all powerful. The devil didn't sneak away from him in the night. Like when Lucifer fell, this was not news to God. And so I'm just so confused with the setup of the story. Within the story, what you say makes sense, but understanding that the story was written by someone who knew how it would all play out is the part that I can't get past.
Yeah, yeah. So it kind of reminds me a little bit of Job, you know, because we all, and I'm part of, when I say we, I as well tend to constantly anthropomorphize God, right? And to put, in fact, Dante, just to go back to my obsession, he says in Paradiso, when he talks about God in the scriptures, he says, we gave God hands and feet, which is a metaphor to say that in order to understand the divine, we have given God gender, for example. You know, we say that God is male, while technically, scholarly speaking, God doesn't have a gender because he's God. So you could potentially talk about God in the female and still be correct. I think it's at the end of the book of Job that God tells him, you know, look at what I've done. Would you have done better? Would you have done it better? And from the atheist argument point of view, this is read as a cop-out. You know, because once you say God's behavior is a mystery and man cannot understand it, then there's nothing else that you can argue against, right? And so it's a cop-out. The argument ends there. From the religious standpoint, is the admission that trying to understand the divine mind, trying to really understand God, is like the insect or the bug, little bug on the wall, trying to understand the physics, you know?
No, yeah, I'm familiar with the argument, and it's fair, assuming there is, well, part of it's fair, assuming that there is something so powerful that it could create, which I cannot. I concede. I cannot make an earth. I cannot design the human genome. And you know, even the boast that God makes in Job when he's questioning Job at this is, look at the Leviathan, like, you know, look at my biggest works here. Do you think you could do this? And it's funny, as a believer, Job was my favorite book. My first tattoo is Job 121. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Because to me, that was such a strong way to never lose connection with God, is that despite me, despite my personal circumstances, nothing is going to interfere there. And it was like a declaration of faith for me.
Yeah.
And it is also the best answer in the Bible to the problem of suffering. From a believer. As soon as I got past a few things and saw the Bible, my interpretation as man-made and not divine-made, all of those things actually turned not just not just fell down, but literally did a 180. To me now, Job is the only book of the Bible where there is actual senseless harm being done to an individual that you can't justify with the need for free will, or leaving man to his own devices, the fall of man, Satan interrupting, having dominion over the earth, like any of the other things that you can maybe point to get out of jail free card. It is the one time that God purposely murdered family, hurt a person to win a bet with the devil, if you're being a little pedantic. Now, so, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and the example with the ant in physics is perfect, because there are things like the other one that I love for not being able to understand something is, if you didn't have a nose, how could you even talk about there being a sense to smell? Like what, how on earth could you, and it's fun to try to imagine, like, what's another sense organ we could have besides ears, tongue, hands, nose? We just can't comprehend it, because without there being that material smell that's invisible that we can't know. So like, you get the point. So I understand if there's something so much greater than us. Where that falls down a little bit, though, is because of what the Bible says, which, if the Bible is inerrant or at least inspired by God and then messed up by man, that's where we get the idea of God having hands and feet, because God reaches out with that idea, and maybe to make himself more approachable to us, you know, and I understand him, but it was It was God who anthropomorphized himself, and maybe again just for our benefit, even if he doesn't truly have our image, but he says we're made in his image, and he says that people saw the face of God and that God turned his back. Like, he is the one using this language, not humans to come up with him. So playing by God's rules is kind of what I feel like we're doing, and in doing so, if I have a mind and I can create, and God has a mind and he can create, and I know in my limited ant worldview, not knowing about physics, that I still wouldn't want to hurt my ant child or make a place where he will burn eternally, I feel like have a responsibility, or a right, I should say, to pass that up and say, you have a mind, creator, and you should be able to do better than me because you made a Leviathan, because you did all the things you boast about. So how did you still get this so wrong? And I think it's fair to say wrong and not misunderstood, because he also says these things are wrong. He says murder is wrong. He says he understands what suffering is. Jesus cried out in pain on the cross. Like, there's a reason that hell is filled with pain and heaven is no tears, death, sorrow, or sin anymore, because God knows, at least to a human or even a spirit in the afterlife, there's something better associated with no pain and something worse associated with pain. So to say like there's this thing in the sky that we can't comprehend, I think is not quite fair.
I see. I mean, I honestly see, and the only thing I can do is to.
And you shouldn't have an answer, by the way, because
no.
Thomas.
Because obviously, I think what makes most sense to me in this type of dialogue, which I love, as I told you, it's the perfect tone and the perfect type of exchange, as I was hoping and I was expecting, is to go back to the origin or the beginning of our point of dialogue, which is we are the two riders on the two elephants speaking to each other, and we can go on forever, but we know, both of us, that what really matters and who makes the real deep decisions are our elephants. You know, when somebody like David Foster Wallace talks about everyone worships, everyone, you know, we cannot get away from worshiping.
Mm-hmm.
And the commencement speech that he made, this is
the water.
That one.
Mm-hmm.
He touched on something that I heard many atheist and non-atheist friends approve and embrace, which is, however you want to twist it, we can imagine a world where the human being is so perfectly like pure rationality, and it exists as something that, you know, only like that, but we know that we are not, and that is not a human being. That is something that works only at a rational level. Is not a human, is something else. It doesn't exist. So what we come with is a baggage of that requires us to worship something. There is a way to push it even further, which is what Pascal said. We have this the God-shaped hole. But I think David Foster Wallace put it in a slightly more open-minded way, because he didn't talk about God. He just said there's something that we need to worship, and if it's not transcendental, it's going to be something earthly, and it's going to eat us alive. That's what he said.
Yeah, I love that speech, and I agree with it. I think it brings people off their high moral horse a little bit to recognize that whatever we're creating as an ideal, that we're holding expectation for God to be, which I do still think is fair to say he's more than human ideal. But regardless, if we're creating an ideal that in my world it would be this, and this shouldn't ever be this, and then we still go home and we talk bad to our wife when we're frustrated, like, we are still so far from whatever ideal that we are so demanding of, and that wouldn't our time better be served improving? And I think that is one point that comes out a little bit of that. Now he goes on to say, you're going to worship something, choose wisely. And so the believer can say, I choose wisely, I choose God. And the non-believer can say, well, I better not let it be money or fame, you know, and I think that's fair too. So yeah, for the most part, like you said, it's something that we can agree on, which is maybe what you're trying to do is bring us together. I don't think I'm an overly critical person, but when there's still parts of something that I don't think are fair or work, I just want to call them out so bad. But I think maybe we should save it for another time, and we can end on the togetherness of still rising to the occasion of whatever ideals we hold and actually portraying them.
Well, you know what? It's to our credit, both of us, I really don't think it's easy to articulate your vision, whatever it is, religious or non-religious, at this level, while not being a scholar, a philosopher, or a theologian. We are just kind of armchair philosophers. And it's not easy. There is a stereotype, I think, that goes around in our world, which is that every major religion or even philosophy is just pretty easy to explain and to grasp. And once you've grasped it, either you accept it or you don't. The more I learn about Christianity, the more I learn that it's not easy to understand. It's not something that, you know, or at least immediate to embrace rationally within the limits that you can use your rationality. So there is another metaphor that again Chesterton made, which was around. I think he talked about Christianity being not something simple, but something very complex, full of things that are not easy to explain, but just like a very complicated key, you know, how the teeth of the key are very complex, but it fits perfectly into the human being, into the human soul. Once again, it's an image, it's a metaphor. I see a lot of sense in it, obviously from my point of view. And if I try to imagine not being religious, then I would see it as simply a quirky, nice little metaphor.
No, I mean, it's a beautiful image. And the thing is if let's say you have to, you know, you mentioned on it earlier, there seems to be two schools of thought, even within religious belief, always lead to God, that there's some aspect of spirituality that believing gets you X. And then there's the other idea that, you know, one religion is true and only one religion. And, you know, from a Christian perspective, I would argue, even though there's moderate Christians that don't, that it is absolutely the only way to the Father is through Jesus. So believing in Allah is not going to get you there, period.
Oh, yeah.
And that's, you know, so at some point you do have to pick a key. And that key example makes a lot of sense if Christianity ends up being true. The problem is that if it's not true, or if there's no God, it's, you know, you've said it before, I'm not trying to be pedantic again, but it's a cop-out to say it's so complex that we're not going to be able to get there, or that God is so complex, or that there's layers.
That's absolutely fair.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know what absolute truth should look like. And I know that I'm just a human, but I would believe that if something's true, if there's just one thing in the universe that's true, if it's the God of Abraham is the only God, and that he made the earth, and that he made us, and he desires connection for us, that the Bible's true, and the main pretense of it is true, that truth should be simple. And it's a truth that everyone ideally would have access to. And the fact that it's not simple, and that still, even in today's modern age, not everyone has access to it, and that if it's truly the only way to not spend an eternity burning, is it's actually, you know, I think you saw my last video, I almost got choked up talking about a short stay in hell, because once you start to get an idea of time, of true eternity, the concept of hell became, like, it didn't seem like a big deal to me to say, when I was a Christian, yeah, the people who are ignorant, the people who have denied God, they're gonna burn forever. You know, and saying it now actually physically almost makes me sick to feel like I could be so calloused into their. And then when you start to understand time, to think that because a Native American was born over here before white guys figured out how to build boats, that they're all in hell because, and then you can get into general relativity. So I'm not expecting you to have an answer or anything. I'm just saying that those concepts in and of themselves were enough for me to say, saying it's complicated doesn't answer some of those extremely simple truths that according to the word, 90% of all people who have ever lived are going to be separated from God. And if this is his design, is for everyone to be with him, it is not working out. That is an overly complicated key that is not unlocking the doors. Like it's, it gets at me because as someone, the reason why it's personal for me, so I've got some friends in my life and we don't have to go on with this too much further, but I have some friends in my life where my brother-in-law always kind of points out, he's like, well, who cares if you just came from primordial soup and you're going to die, like, why does it matter? You know, to have these arguments and conversations or to spend so much time still looking at Christian text or apologetics and thinking about it. It's because my wife is still Christian. My children are being raised Christian. And the idea that I'm going to be somehow responsible for them thinking it's okay to have their neighbors, just because they were born in a house that didn't have a Bible in it, are going to be exposed to the worst pain imaginable for the time that we still can't fathom, no matter how many cute books we read about it. I don't ever want them to be callous to that. And so I think that that's where our next conversation should be. So maybe it's good I brought it up, because what I said is I think religion is harmful. And you got a small clip of why I think that. And you said that you would love to help me understand that it's not. So maybe this was conversation one. In conversation two, we can try to address that a little more. I'd really like that.
Yeah, no, I like it that way. It was important to kind of confront our views on these probably fundamental points, and once again, I really stress the fact that it's not an easy thing to have this type of conversations, because is not easy to find somebody who is had at your same level of intellectual curiosity. Once again, not intelligence, but intellectual curiosity, and you know, because it's rare, and B, it's you know, even if you do find them, then it's too easy to, you know, the debate gives us too much pleasure to not fall into it. So we tend to get into the debate, and that's an easy trend of this type of conversation. So thank you for being very for keeping the tone really great for this conversation.
Oh, I hope I did. There's a part of me that still feels like I maybe fell into the debating aspect more than I wanted to. But like you said, it's when two people have two different viewpoints and you try to defend it. And I think what both of us did well, and what I'm encouraged by, is that we weren't defending it from saying we're right, because I think both of us, to a degree, obviously with certain aspects of your faith, you can't say, well, I don't know. You're claiming through faith that you know. But both of us are saying there's a lot of things we don't know. And in whatever part of this came out as debate, it was, to me, more as trying to construct and say, what is it that we don't know and why we think we can't know that thing. So I think that it was pretty fair from that regard.
Yeah. So thank you again. And sorry we didn't mention as many books as we were hoping to mention, because but I think a couple
All right, we still got through a few.
Yeah, a couple of interesting titles came up anyway. So if I remember, I will include them here, and look forward to part two. You know, anytime we can, maybe, I don't know, in a month or so, whenever we both have time. But this is the beauty of BookTube. Find somebody that you wouldn't find normally in your, you know, going out the street or maybe at work, and where you can have this type of, at least great for us, conversations. Then if somebody else is interested, that's even better.
Yeah, I'm grateful regardless of anyone watches this. I really enjoyed speaking to you. You're very, again, it's hard for me to find people that are believing, kind, and open-minded. I think it's a trifecta that usually self-defeats itself. So I appreciate
Absolutely.
it. And
Absolutely.
thank you for having me on. It's really, really nice to speak to you.
Thanks a lot, Brandon.